Welcome to Socially Unacceptable, from f***ups to fame, the marketing podcast that celebrates the professional mishaps, mistakes and misjudgments while delivering valuable marketing and life lessons in the time it takes you to eat your lunch.
Why are people doing this?
Money, right?
It's mental.
Yeah, money. I mean, the people who create that kind of content drive you off of Facebook and onto off of those platforms where there is some moderation, onto their own sites and onto other places where they can monetize you without limit.
How big an issue is it?
We know. I think a few things we know. It's only going to get worse. So we know we're in an election cycle, not just in the US, but around the world. More than half the world's population is voting in elections this year, which is a real big driver of misinformation because people have a political goal. And I'm walking with David Cameron to the tent, about to brief him on the lines, just to make sure he remembers. It was all about civilian casualties. It was a really serious topic.
Yeah.
And then on the way to the tent, he's like, you know what? I haven't got time for this. I've got to do these other things instead.
What a
So I walked into the tent and I called across the interpreter. I said, David Cameron isn't coming. They just rush from the stations they were at, grab the cameras, grab the mics. Cameras are in my face, red lights are on. And I'm like, they think I'm David Cameron. So I've got two choices now.
Welcome back to Socially Unacceptable, the only podcast for marketers and comms professionals that celebrates the biggest mistakes and helps you learn practical lessons from other people's misfortune. All so you can grow your brand quicker. Have you ever carefully crafted a brilliant marketing campaign, poised to launch your brand into the stratosphere, only to see it crash and burn because of a single spark of misinformation or fake news? Well, you're not alone, because this is happening to so many brands in 2024. We've seen numerous examples of misinformation for brands such as Cadbury's, Disney, Coca-Cola, Tesco, and even the BBC. And it's not just the big brands anymore. Today's show will equip you with the tools not just to survive, but to thrive in an era of alternative facts and fake news. Join me, and as always, my business partner, Will Ockenden, and today's very special guest, Ant Cousins, as we dissect the anatomy of misinformation. We'll look at the tactics for online manipulators, and we'll do our best to find a way forward for you and your brand. In this week's episode, we speak to Ant Cousins, who is Executive Director of AI Strategy at Cision. He has a fascinating work history, having been involved in comms departments in the Armed Forces, Ministry of Defence, and even the Cabinet Office. And there's some brilliant mistakes in there. So as always, sit back, relax, and let's hear all about how you can avoid brand misinformation. Enjoy. Hi everybody, welcome back to Socially Unacceptable. This week we've got in the studio Ant Cousins from Cision. Hi Ant, welcome to the studio.
Thank you for having me.
So you've had a fascinating career, and we're going to talk about brand misinformation in a minute. But before we get into that, because that's what this podcast is all about, I just want to hear about your experience in communications in the Armed Forces. And you originally worked for the public sector, didn't you? Do you want to just tell us a bit about that? Because I've heard you've got some interesting stories around that.
Yeah, so my CV makes no sense to anybody if you read it on paper. It doesn't make any sense at all. Starting off in IT, I did 5 or 6 years in straight IT development roles, building databases and things like that. And then I got on a leadership scheme, and they said, if you do one more job in IT, you're screwed. You've got to do something different. And I saw in a newspaper, this is how old I am, right? I saw in a newspaper, it said an MOD spokesperson said to them, and I was like, that seems like a cool job. How do I be an MOD spokesperson? And they're like, you're not ready for a press office. And I was like, I think I'm ready for a press office. And I managed to wangle myself into an interview, got a job there. And this was at the height of the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we were basically front page news every day. And I didn't realize at the time how almost lucky I was to end up in a press office where that's just, you're dealing with it all the time, only to find some people never really ever get a front page story or a headline news item. I joined the MOD press office in 2006. I was there through 2008 and had roles there in regional media. The and rock and roll desk was my desk. So when guys in the armed forces do some things a bit wrong, things go off the rails, right, I'd be the guy dealing with that kind of story. But I also ended up getting deployed to Afghanistan during the summer of 2008. Okay. Which was a pretty tough time. That was a really bad year for the armed forces. So it was a grueling time. I don't think I came back the same person that went out, if I'm honest, there. But there were, so I think the story you're referring to is the one that Darryl might have mentioned. So
I said I'd give him a shout out. So thanks for the message on Twitter, Darryl. He said I had specifically had to ask you for this. So,
So the strange. This is where. At the time, right, everyone asked me, what do you do for a living? And I was like, I work for the Ministry of Defence. Like, oh, so you're James Bond. I was like, no. Like, one, he works for the Foreign Office. But two, I'm closer to Johnny English than James Bond. Like, none of my stories are cool.
Mr. Bean?
James Bond wasn't a PR man anyway, was he?
No, not really.
James Bond in PR. In Moncton, yeah.
So one of the things was we had David Cameron coming out for a visit. Right, to Afghanistan. And we'd booked a live satellite link up, and we've got a load of journalists in from Kabul down to Lashkar in Helmand province, which is where I was based, which is a long and arduous journey, a risky journey for those journalists to take. But we had them coming down for a member of British Parliament, because this was just before he was Prime Minister. Right, so he's still a member of Parliament at the time. So he comes out, and we booked the slot, we got the tent, all the journalists are in there, they're ready to go. The satellite link up's booked for live broadcast across Afghanistan. And I'm walking with David Cameron to the tent and about to brief him on like the lines just to make sure he remembers. It was all about civilian casualties. It was a really serious topic.
Yeah.
And then on the way to the tent, he's like, I haven't got time for this. I've got to do these other things instead. And I was like, okay. So
what a git.
So we're like, well, okay, how do I deal with that? How do I deal with that? So I walked into the tent and I called across the interpreter and I bring her across. I said, like, David Cameron isn't coming. And he's like looking at fear in my eyes because he's been dealing with a journalist this whole time.
Yeah.
And then because Afghan journalists, they just rush from the stations they're at, grab the cameras, grab the mics, they come to the flap of the tent, right? And they just, cameras are in my face, red lights are on, mics are in my face, and I'm like, oh, they think I'm David Cameron. So I tell the interpreter, tell them I'm not David Cameron. And he's like, just zero. Like, he just starts interpreting their questions. I'm like, so I've got two choices now, right? I either empty chair us and walk away, and the headline is David Cameron walks away and blanks a bunch of journalists asking difficult questions.
Which is what he did, just to be clear.
Which is what I didn't do. So what I made up for is just did the interview. Like, and I think I knew the lines, you know.
So did they quote you as David Cameron says?
So when I got back to my desk, there were a few red lights on the phone. So yeah, the ticker David Cameron was there.
And how did you get? Did you just say terrible misunderstanding? I did explain myself.
I think I just left it, you know, because I think we all kind of to Afghans is kind of like the reason they thought I was, even though I had a beard and a shaved head, they still thought I was David Cameron. I'm like, they're not going to. It doesn't matter.
That's the image I've got of David.
I delivered the lines.
So in his new role as Foreign Secretary, next time he goes out there, there's going to be a lot of confusion. He's going to do an interview and everyone's going to say, this isn't David Cameron.
This isn't David Cameron, I remember.
Where's Ant?
Yeah.
You've aged badly, David. Anyway.
Okay, so
thanks for that.
Great story. So today's episode's all about brand misinformation. So your current title at Cision is now Executive Director of Strategy and AI. Is that correct?
AI strategy.
AI strategy.
When I came up with that title, I was thinking, well, we're at some point we're going to automate the job of creating the AI, but we still need someone to think about the AI we need, right? So okay. I just wanted to be the last person in before we turn off the lights.
So tell us a little bit about. I mean, we understand Cision here. Our listeners might not. Tell us a little bit about what Cision do and your role within Cision in an AI context.
Got it. So Cision is probably, depending on how you measure it, the largest media monitoring or social media listening company in the world, because Cision has a bunch of products, including PR Newswire, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Brandwatch, I'm sure you're familiar with. Cision itself has a media monitoring product called Cision One, which we released in the summer of last year. And a whole bunch of insights, briefing, and things like that, which we do for some of the biggest companies in the world. So size-wise, we're probably the biggest. We've probably got the biggest share of the biggest companies in the world. My role is in thinking about, and this kind of came out of the acquisition of FactMatter, the company I was running, was thinking about, okay, how do we apply AI to every part of this business? Not just to our products, but internally, to our insights guys, to engineering, to sales, customer success. Every part of a business now has an opportunity to get more efficient and better, and frankly, more meaningful work through AI. So I'm applying my 10 odd years of experience in working in AI to that kind of problem now.
So I think let's take the social listening side of things briefly. I think we all understand the concept of social listening. To bring it to life a bit, in which ways can AI kind of enhance what we're currently doing then when it comes to social listening?
Got it. Well, the biggest problem with social listening is the amount of content, right? And this is the problem for not just for marketers, but in PR. if you're trying to use social media, you need to make it strategic. So the biggest challenge is the volume of content, and that is something that AI is great at, right? It can churn through lots of content and give you some classifications, give you some categories, give you some trends, give you some insights. So I think that's a great use of AI where humans don't have the time to get through that amount of content. Just tell me what this means. Tell me what is relevant about this to my brand or to what I'm interested in.
What fascinated me is we've been doing social listening since before, when it first ever came out, and I helped with to tweak a couple of the social listening platforms right at the very beginning. And it was always sentiment, because the coded, the computer, if you say something is excellent.
Shit hot is a good example.
I didn't want to swear in the first 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, we've done it now, so fuck it. If you say something is shit hot, it thinks that's a negative rather than a positive. Has AI now solved sentiment, or are we still churning out social listening platforms that still don't get it right and just guess?
I am pleased to say yes. We can now move beyond basic sentiment, right? The sentiment, which just over 10 years old now, we've been using it well beyond its purpose because it's all we've had. Right? And we've almost, because of that, normalized how bad sentiment is for any real, true measurement and outcomes, all right? So there's many different ways we can do that. So when I was at Fact Matter, we developed a kind of a targeted sentiment model, which is, it is still sentiment, but you can tell it a specific object to orientate the sentiment around.
Wow.
What I mean by that is we actually had a test, which you can probably find online. We looked at a tweet, and the quote of the tweet was, "Excellent, I'll be voting no in any Scottish referendum then!" ! Now, a typical sentiment model would score that as positive. Ends in an exclamation mark, starts with excellent, no inherently negative connotation words in there. But if what you really want to do is know how is a person going to vote in a Scottish referendum, which is actually the kind of thing you'd want to know, then it's a polar opposite, like absolute negative, right? So that's something that our model can now detect. So we're going to radically change. I think polling, pollsters are going to get a real boost, I think.
So you the way that you got to Cision is you sold your business. Fact Matters or Matter?
Fact Matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us a bit about that then. What was that process, and how long did you have that business?
So that was originally founded by a guy called Trove who just very helpful timing. I'd just finished a role for a startup, getting them set up and off the ground. I was looking for my next challenge, and it was a bit far from communications, whereas that is my kind of core. I wanted to get back to communications, and the thing that drove me to it was that I was in Egypt just after the fall of President Mubarak. I was on the first diplomatic mission into Egypt to find out who's left, who can we be friends with, what's the situation here. And throughout that period, I saw, for me, the peak of what social media can do for the world, which is they got democracy in a country which was non-democratic just because they wanted it. Right? Their use of social media to organize themselves, to organize themselves faster than the security apparatus had ever been able to respond in the past, and to share their stories with the world and get support. Amazing. I was like, this social media is amazing, going to change the world. And this is 2010, right?
When everything was positive.
When everything was positive. And then, of course, over the course of that period, we saw Twitter was having money troubles. Facebook back then was having money troubles. Like, how do we monetize?
Yeah.
And they were moving more and more towards advertising, creating the tool set to support advertising, which was what then Cambridge Analytica and other companies started exploiting and harvesting information. So we were heading towards the nadir, and I think we hit the nadir like in the middle of the teens. And I was like, how do I get back to working on this problem? And Trove had, a visionary, had seen, well, AI is nearly at the state where I think we can use it to help identify this false content, negative content, trends in that space, to allow us to act more strategically, to fix those kind of narratives before they take hold and take root in people's minds, and then we end up with all the social conflict, the COVID misinformation, undermining democracy, and all the negative connotations. So this is the most important mission in the world. That's why I wanted to get back into
and when you use social media, listen, like if we're doing a campaign for a client and a client's got a crisis going on, we've done various campaigns where we've had to assess they've come to us and said, can you assess the situation? Can you tell us who the protagonists are? Who is influencing whom? Now, I imagine that AI in that respect now is really cutting through that, because the Arab Spring uprising that you're talking about there, if they'd have had something that could spot the key protagonists and the people, or the influencers, not to use the generic term influencers, but actually the proper people that were influencing decisions and things that were taking place. That would be really powerful, right?
Yeah, for good or bad, right? AI is, and I'm sure we'll come onto this, AI is just a tool at the end of the day. What the company was when I took it over was trying to understand what is true and what is false. And I slightly changed that to suggest that I don't think any one company should own the truth. And it's not possible for any one company to own the truth, because no matter how hard you try, there is going to be bias in how you interpret that. So I changed the model to be more of a picks and shovels model. So I was like, let's build a tool set which anybody can use to understand, okay, this might be false. Based on all the research we've done and the training of the models, we think this might be false. You need to take a call on it. We found this might be racist, but you need to take a call on it as a human. So we've basically built a tool set which allow people to kind of flag that harmful content, because it can read 1 million pieces of content in a few seconds. It can flag those trends and tell you, like, rather than this post, and this post is harmful, this post and this post and this post are part of a trend.
Yeah.
Here's where that trend started. Here's who started that trend. Who else is involved in that trend. That's what you need to make social strategic.
Okay, and when we talk about misinformation, a lot of it is about kind of at government level, typically around elections and things like that. An example of that, which I found quite chilling, around the Trump election, apparently there was misinformation, possibly from Russia, advertising the day of voting in black neighborhoods as the day after the actual day of voting, to make these black neighborhoods who would have voted against Trump miss their opportunity to vote. So it's quite frightening, isn't it? And how sophisticated and how clever it is.
Allegedly.
That's actually quite a simplistic attack if that was Russian.
Well, give us an example of something more sophisticated then that we're seeing at a governmental level.
Yeah, so the Russian misinformation has actually been in place for many, many years. So if you look at Ukraine, right, which is a strategic goal for Russia is still victory in Ukraine, whatever they define victory as. If you look at the Telegram channels and the social media channels that are less well monitored and protected, and look at the misinformation happening there, they've exploited over 10 years worth of complex undermining of social structures, particularly in the US, to get to the point where they can now convince people that it's actually Nazis running Ukraine, right? And that happened through COVID. So they were supporting, obviously, COVID misinformation theories. So you've got people in the US now thinking, right, if I believe that the conspiracy theories around COVID, and I find a bunch of Telegram channels which agree with that, I'm going to trust those channels. And if those channels are also the channels that tell me that the election was stolen, then all of a sudden I've got 2 data points of why I trust these channels. And if those channels now say that there's Nazis running Ukraine, well, they agree with my worldview on these 2 other major points. So I'm likely to believe them on these things. But that's like years and years.
So very structured, strategic, long-term.
Totally, yeah. I'm not going to say they didn't do that, but that's like simplistic compared to what the way they think about misinformation.
So people listening to this show are brand managers, marketers, and they're going to be saying, brand misinformation, is that really an issue for us? And we've seen various campaigns that we've been involved in, a lot of which were NDA'd to the high heavens. But there's brand misinformation campaigns for Disney, for Cola, for Nike, for Tesco. With COVID, they had some COVID vaccine misinformation. I wonder, what do you think brand managers and brand owners can do to minimise misinformation against their own brand? Because it is coming for anyone and everyone, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, and how big an issue is it?
We know. I think a few things we know. It's only going to get worse, right? Because the ability for generative AI to create more credible sounding misinformation is now there, which it wasn't there before. Previously, it was quite easy to identify because the way it was written was often pretty poor. I mean, like typos, just the formatting, lack of references to sources. There was a number of kind of lexical similarities we could use to identify misinformation, which are now a lot harder because generative AI can create quite credible sounding content. So we know it's only going to get worse. We know we're in an election cycle, not just in the US, but around the world. More than half the world's population is voting in elections this year, which is a real big driver of misinformation because people have a political goal. The challenge for brands is that I think, and this is my hypothesis, right? There's not as much research for this. Gen Z buy more based on belief and values than any other demographic group, or at least that was the case. My belief is that whilst they, with their affinity of social media, figured out they had the power, every group now realizes they have the power if they can get together in enough kind of numbers. So everybody's now cancelling everyone else for whatever they can find the evidence for. So everyone is wielding this power. But that power is based upon their understanding of the facts and understanding of the world, which makes misinformation strategically more risky for brands. It makes it even more risky, seeing as also there is another trend. Every brand is becoming more political. And I think that is happening because we are demanding of the brands we buy for. Gen Z buying more based on belief. Zara, I don't want you using sweatshops in X or Z, right? The misinformation around Zara came out. Adidas had a similar risk on that kind of thing. If you track their supply chain far enough back, there's slaves in the supply chain in China was a misinformation.
And very, very recently, main story on the news, Boohoo, misinformation on their labelling of their own products in the UK.
Right. So every brand, and they're going to get punished for that, right? People will undoubtedly make buying decisions because of that, right? So every brand is going to get politicized to a point where they need to understand what are the groups and their values and how they support me. What is the kind of misinformation that would cause those groups to stop buying from me? And I need to understand those now. And my advice is don't wait for the misinformation to catch you in the crosshairs. Get ahead of that. And be clear on your values, be clear on your ESG, FX, get those publicized. Don't wait until after you're accused of something to then produce evidence to the contrary. Too late.
You're on the back foot, aren't you?
You're on the back foot. Get ahead of that.
But we'll come into the practicalities in a minute, I think, about how brands can actually sort of protect themselves against this and be on the front foot. But I mean, whether this is an obvious question or not, who's driving this? You know, the Coca-Cola example, we've got a Disney example. Is it Pepsi doing it against Coca-Cola? What's the agenda here? Why are people attacking brands? Is it just activists that don't agree with the brands, or they don't agree in capitalism, or whatever it might be?
Yeah, the actors is really interesting. So there's a lot of people making a lot of money from misinformation and disinformation, right? Alex Jones in the US wasn't a multimillionaire because of his charisma. So there's a lot of people making a lot of money from coming up with stories people will buy into.
Crypto.
So, right. People are playing on people's fears. They're playing on their interests, their inherent beliefs and biases, their inherent challenges. They're playing on that to create content. It's not like they care at all about the content they're creating. They'll create whatever it takes to get clicks. And so this comes back to the fundamental power of the internet, right? It's driven by advertising. It's driven by clicks and attention. So the number one reason is money. The number two reason is, I think, political or social power. So people build followships, they build groups, and they can use that to achieve either social influence, political influence, economic influence. If you can get a group of people to follow you, you can wield that power. And the way you get people to follow you is to create fear of other groups, fear of consequences, and anger. Fear and anger are typically the methods you'd find.
So I think
Hello, Brexit. Hello, Brexiteers.
Well, I mean, this is playing into the whole idea that we've never been more divided as a society, and it's so polarizing on social media now, isn't it? I've got an example actually to bring this to life of misinformation. I'm sure you've got some brand examples. So we were kind of doing a little bit of research around some of the big examples of brand misinformation. This is a little bit old, but in 2022, Disney World, somebody posted a TikTok video about Disney World claiming that they were going to lower the drinking age to 18, and it created a huge shitstorm in the media. It got millions and millions of views on TikTok, and Disney were dragged into this debate about the fact that how could they ethically lower the drinking age to 18 in Disney World, and it was completely falsified. And there's certain websites behind it, which obviously got millions and millions of views. The TikTok channel obviously got huge amounts of influence. And you would think why, but I think you've answered that. It's about gaining a community, isn't it? And it's about gaining some sort of power and followers.
Yeah, so I mean, Disney's a really good example. They're caught in a number of different crosshairs, right? So they had a real challenge a few years ago with the Don't Say Gay bill fiasco in Florida. So that brought out, I think, a number of different conspiracy theories. And the challenge with these kind of examples is a lot of NDAs, but they weren't our client at the time, so I can talk about this. Although I'm pretty sure they're maybe a Cision client, I'm not sure. So I need to be a little bit more
You'll find out when this goes live.
But a couple of years ago, they had a few different misinformation kind of issues. So yes, there was that one. There was also allegations that were involved in child trafficking, right? Which is a classic one for Disney. It's like, we have access to children. So of course, that the most easy to believe conspiracy theory is the one that kind of makes the most kind of like basic common sense to the people who are going to be believing that kind of stuff. So they're caught in a number of different crosshairs, but the fundamental driver for a lot of those is Disney is seeking with its content to be more inclusive, right? To balance the scales of many, many decades of a lack of inclusive content, right? And I think that's amiable, that's kind of believable, that's understandable. But there's a whole bunch of people who aren't happy with that, who feel like they're being disempowered and they're being targeted and attacked for being in the group that was previously well supported. Star Wars, great example of the same thing. So I think they're paying the price for that group, and that group happens to be one of the groups that is most happy to get online and just abuse and create. So yeah, that's my own kind of personal view on the challenges for Star Wars. They've been targeting a specific group, which is more than happy to take their abuse out on other companies.
Any brands in the UK then that listeners will be used to that you can? Have you got?
I've got an example. Yeah, in 2021, Nike faced a backlash for advertising on websites that was spreading. So this is the other reverse. Nike was advertising on websites that were spreading COVID-19 misinformation, and although unintentional, the association with the platforms tarnished the brand and got people talking about who were health conscious and misinformation during COVID. Wow. There was a guy that spoke at the PR conference down in Brighton. His name escapes me, but I'm hoping to get him on the show because he was in charge of the misinformation of COVID-19, like minimalising it, not doing it.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. What's your experience of some of the worst examples of misinformation in the UK?
Yeah, so it was hard specifically in the UK because I think a lot of those were global narratives. But we were tracking. This was when I was at Fact Matter. We were using our AI to detect those kind of issues. And a good example we found, actually this is a pretty sharp example now I think about it, we found a narrative that started in, I think it started in the US, where people were taking authoritative numbers for death figures for COVID and taking the whole number and using that online and saying, look, more people that have died, that have taken the vaccine, than have not taken the vaccine. Now, of course, that's true because more people have taken the vaccine. Many more people have taken the vaccine, but they were leaving out the percentages and leaving out that context. So if you just look at that whole number, you're going, oh my God, vaccines are killing people. That was their narrative. That came out of a few people who weren't followed by many people. They weren't particularly interesting in accounts in the US. There was a Scottish version of that where they took numbers from released specifically to Scotland and did the same thing. They were effectively localizing and targeting that same global narrative using statistics from individuals to make it relevant and feel, close to people. And we saw that kind of bumble around for a couple of months. It got picked up by a Texan lawmaker who had more followers. He gave it a bump, and that narrative became starting to become established. But it still wasn't getting picked up by anyone, still wasn't being dealt with, wasn't being addressed. No one was coming out and explaining the reason why it was untrue. And then I think it was an American influencer, Candace Owens, picked up on the same thing. She retweeted it and she had like 5.1 million followers. And after that, it was the number one COVID conspiracy going for a period of 3 or 4 months. So hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have been exposed to that. You probably heard of that. Yeah. And it started in August, September of the year before it really picked up. Well,
the scariest example he gave in Brighton was that in the UK, what they do is you use tools like what you're talking about, with your social monitoring to identify the key things to engage with, because there was that much misinformation around COVID-19. And one of the biggest stories was, right at the peak of lockdowns, is that if you've got COVID-19, drinking boiling water because it's so hot kills the virus. And they were like, oh my God, this is a serious health risk. And they had to release. And it's just like, why are people doing this?
Money, right?
It's mental.
Yeah, money. I mean, the people who create that kind of content drive you off of Facebook and off of those platforms where there is some moderation, onto their own sites and onto other places where they can monetize you without limit.
And on that, actually, I've got a stat here, which is frightening, and I'm keen to get your view on this. Campaign Magazine did a study about brands unwittingly advertising on misinformation sites. And in the US, for every $2.16 spent on news websites, $1 of that is spent on misinformation. So almost half of all their ad budget online is inadvertently spent on misinformation sites.
I feel like we might have contributed to that study. That sounds familiar to some work we did in a few years back. So yeah, it's a real problem. I think there's a really good bunch of folks you find them on LinkedIn and Twitter, called Check My Ads. They're trying to shine a light on this problem because the whole infrastructure supporting ad deployment doesn't really give you as a brand much control and insight to exactly where those ads are going. It's all controlled and automated, So, and there's a lot of people making a lot of money from fraudulently placing the ads.txt on other sites and grabbing the numbers and making their site seem legit. Like, there's a load of different ways people are kind of manipulating the system, again, just to make money. So I think that some ways people look at this and go, there's like an ideological drive for this. It's what drives everything else, it's money.
So there's no grand sort of conspiracy or political agenda. It's basically a load of people wanting to make a load of money.
I think if it weren't making them so much money, we wouldn't be worrying about it as much.
And
as
what's scary now is the generative AI is just churning out content. It can just do it. You can just churn out tons and tons of content. Okay, so if I'm in a small marketing team, because there's a lot of people out there listening to this that will be working in small marketing teams that are just going, okay, this is really fascinating, because it is fascinating, but what do we do? What do we do to check that everything is in order and we are as prepared as we can be for misinformation against my brand?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think definitely don't wait for it to happen. Mm-hmm. There's a few things you can do before that. So pre-bunking has been proven to work. We did a lot of that in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So knowing what the other side is going to claim helps you. If you can think about that, like, what are the risks to your business? Like, and there are, depending on your industry. So in fact, this is probably a good example. I've not used this for ChatGPT, but you could probably ask it to think about some of that kind of stuff. Like, what are the likely risks to your industry or to your brand? Think about those things. Get your lines to take in advance.
Oh yeah, I'll do that.
The other thing is making sure, if you are doing something which proves that, get that out there. Like I said, don't wait until someone accuses you of being a racist company or non-inclusive to then go, oh, but we've got these stats. Get that out there beforehand. Publish that. Get it on your website before the date of the accusation, because everything you say after the accusation is going to get seen through the lens of the lie.
Yeah.
So plenty of things you can do before. Another thing you can do before is get your lawyers ready. So don't be afraid. We've seen this with the misinformation on election machines in the US. Suing people really does work. So if you and there is
there's a particular ex-president that loves doing that, isn't there?
Right. So it works. It has an effect. Get your lawyers prepared. Know what your lines are going to be. Like, at what point are we going to take people to court when they accuse us of doing something that's not true, etc. We have laws in place, right? We have libel, right? We have other ways you can punish people for lying about your business. So,
and okay, so we've pre-bunked to the nth degree. We've published proactive content saying, you know what, you shouldn't drink boiling water. It's going to hurt your throat or whatever it might be. We've got our lawyers teed up. How do we actually know when misinformation is published about us as a brand? Is it just a case of suddenly the chief exec knocks on our door and says, what's this about? Or can we be much more proactive about it?
Yeah, so that's something where I think you either throw a lot of humans at it, or AI is frankly the only way. Because the challenge with it is it starts in small numbers, right? It often starts in small numbers, and you have to spot it early. It's like, honestly, it works like a virus. You have to spot it early and understand where it's happening and target it at the source. Who is driving it? If you can get those accounts taken down, great. Do that as much as you can. If you can flag that content, do that. But spotting it early is key, and for that, I think there is only AI. And that's something that obviously we developed at Fact Matter. There are other companies out there playing in that space. So AI is probably your only source of that, and it's a classic case of AI can be used for good or for bad, but it is definitely being used by bad people.
Oh, it will be.
So we only have the choice. We have to use it as a tool to defend ourselves.
So a lot of the work we do at Prohibition is in crisis management, and we do what we call kind of next generation crisis management, where we actually use social listening tools to track evolving narratives. We look at antagonists and how those conversations, and we often you've got 100 kind of conversations, and you kind of select the most influential before we engage, and that's the approach we take, because you can't engage with everybody.
Yep.
Is that the case with misinformation? So there's an awful lot of false claims about, let's say you're a utility company or you work in FMCG. If there's 100, 200 false claims, how do you make a judgment on when and where to engage?
It's a really good question. I think it's going to vary slightly by sector and by industry, because in some industries, you're right, there's a large number of very spurious claims which almost drown each other out, right? So you don't need to worry about those until it gets to an account with a level of reach or popularity or followership that's going to cause you problems. So you might want to set some fairly standard bars, right? We get 100 spurious claims a week, but until someone's got more than 1,000 followers, that's our bar for causing action. And you might be able to build that over time. In other cases, in other industries, you might not have that much of a problem right now, in which case you need to spot everything. And understand the relative risk of that. But that's where I think the narrative aspect comes in. So what you're doing is going through a huge amount of content and developing what you kind of form as those narratives. Narratives change slightly over time. They can meld and kind of morph into other areas. They can split and branch into different sub-narratives, as we saw with the COVID misinformation, right? COVID vaccines will kill you became individual targeted, like Scottish people are dying because of so-and-so. So spotting the way that the narratives branch, I think, and mapping that is another way you can kind of get back to source.
And it sounds like this needs, I remember when Chris and I, years ago, were writing crisis plans, and so many clients didn't have a social media crisis plan. And this is 12 years ago, and we always used to say, look, social is absolutely part of your, and we'd meld the two together. But presumably, it feels like we need misinformation clauses now in crisis plans. It feels like it's absolutely part of a preemptive.
But that is I suppose, misinformation, because you're talking about when we were doing crisis plans, when we do them for clients, we're looking for if they've got an issue or a problem, a real issue. This is like, is it also an issue for you're talking if people make it up as well?
Yeah. I just feel like this. Would you typically include this in a traditional, or I say traditional, in a brand's crisis plan? It's preemptive crisis management in effect, isn't it?
Absolutely, because if you treat kind of earned media and social separately, sometimes things start with a slow board on social media, and you've got to catch them before they flip, right?
Yeah.
Because once so many people have seen it, a journalist is going to go, I need to address this, right? So you kind of need to have social media in your plan from a listing perspective and from an engagement perspective, such that when the journalist gets involved, they see your voice and your point of view. Because if all they have access to is the misinformation, it's going to color their story. Then you've got the stuff that comes out directly from journalists because they've had access to a source which might be misinformation. Or maybe they break something which is actually untrue. And that causes social media as a reaction. So it can flip between the two. The stuff we developed at FactMatter allows you to track across both earned and social and combines it to a single view. So for any narrative, you can see, actually this one started on Reddit, jumped to Twitter, then it was on both, and then it grew to the point where it became a journalist or a traditional news kind of outlet got involved. And you can see that track over time and trace it back to it was this individual post in this Reddit thread. So you've got to have the mapping in place, but it is hard labor. I'm glad you guys are putting a focus on it, frankly.
So I think we've covered brand misinformation quite a bit. I'm quite interested to see, the show is called, our strapline is Fuck Ups to Fame. I know you're very good at your job, so have you
we'll know
ever,
in 5 years' time.
have you ever made any fuck ups in your career?
Other than doing an interview with David Cameron.
Which was a great story, by the way.
Would I do that again? Probably not. I would say, I think, on the way in, we were talking about, right, the FactMatter journey. So when I took over FactMatter, there wasn't a lot of money left. There was really good tech, but we need to work out how to monetize it and productize it and get it to market. This is pre-AI boom, right? So it was difficult to get funding, which is not difficult now. If you've got AI, just slap generative on your AI startup and you've just 10x your funding potential. When I arrived, there was a plan, and I think I did as best as I could to get through that plan as fast as possible to get out to market. I won a few decent clients, but it just wasn't enough to prove product market fit in order to get more investment. So we're in a position of really need to sell the business. Want to get some kind of outcome for the investors, for the team, and because I didn't want to see that technology go to waste. I wanted to see it being used. So we ended up in kind of an acquisition discussion with Cision, which kind of went through. But that whole period from taking over the business to selling was the most stressful and difficult period of my life.
How long is that? How long a period?
That was a year.
Right.
A year and a bit, effectively, from taking over. And it was like always short of cash, always desperately trying to get the next sale, always desperately trying to kind of share progress, keep the team motivated and engaged, all of which were super talented and could have got a lot more money anywhere else. But we all believed in the mission, right? We believed the technology was worthwhile. So we took it into the acquisition conversation. I think I got my last paycheck in April of 2019. April of 22 was when I got my last paycheck until we completed the sale in November of 22. And that whole period, I was basically just building up debt and putting my wife through incredible stress. Like, we just had a baby in October of 21. So I basically, in that period, I had like a 6-month to a 1-year-old baby and a job that wasn't paying me any money at all. And everything hung on getting that sale to go through. And I believed that it would, but in hindsight, and this is kind of like the definition of success or a fuck up, right? You could look on paper and go, I sold a business which was in kind of a tough situation, great job, well done. And if you just look at the financials, you could say that was a success. But you also have to look at the toll that it took on me. I definitely didn't have this much grey hair going into that year. Look at the toll it took on my wife, on our relationship. And I think you have to look back and judge it by those factors as well.
Would you do it again?
On any given day, I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe not. I was in Iraq, right? I was in Afghanistan, across the Middle East during difficult times. No PTSD. That sale, PTSD.
Wow.
Like, just sometimes the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I get emotional thinking about it because it was by far the most difficult thing I've ever done.
What did it feel like when it went through? Was there a sense of relief or just chronic tiredness?
You can't imagine the relief, really, because this is the fuck up. I had no plan B. I was so committed and dedicated to making that happen. It was all I did all day, every day. And you won't believe the amount of effort that goes into selling a business, even a small one. It was all I did all day, every day. So the relief was unbelievable. But yeah, in hindsight, and I said, we had an advisor advising us through the process. And I said to him, that felt really, really hard. And he's like, yeah, that's the hardest acquisition I've seen in 20 years.
Jeez.
That's not what you want to hear.
That's not what I want to hear.
You got a nice swift one, don't you?
Yeah. So I think in hindsight, on paper, a good outcome for the business, but the toll that took, and this is the advice for anyone going through a position. I had that confidence it was going to happen, but I think in hindsight, you need that kind of confidence to be a CEO, right? If you're easily kind of rebuffed or easily swayed, CEO isn't a role for you, right? You have to have that unbelievable, absolute dedication and commitment. And that maybe is what made it happen, but it has also blinded me to, yes, but a plan B would have made a lot of frickin' sense, Yeah. Cultivating some job opportunities elsewhere. But that would have taken time, and I didn't spend that time.
But if you'd started to doubt yourself, the whole thing would have fallen apart.
But it would have fallen apart from a financial perspective, from the business perspective. But it's a private limited company, right? There was going to be no fallback. I would have had a debt, right? And I would have had a waste of time. But I would have got a job, no doubt, kind of somewhere else. I wouldn't have put that much stress on my wife. So it comes down to, is it a success or is it a fuck up? If you look at it on paper, it might have been a success, but that was not a success from the perspective of my relationship, from looking after my child, from all those factors,
That sounds like a particular gritty one, and anyone that's thinking of sending a business will be having second thoughts. What about your story about Ross Kemp?
We like a Ross Kemp story.
We love
here
a
on
Ross
the show.
Kemp story. I love it.
So that was so unlucky. So in Helmand Province, right, we had Ross Kemp filming some documentaries with, I think it normally was with the Royal Anglicans. I'm not sure if that was the regiment it was with, because it was the Paras that was over there mostly. So he was based at one of the forward operating bases, just doing interviews, down with the guys, etc. And it just so happened that particular forward operating base, an Apache crew, right, one of the attack helicopters, was taking off. I don't know what happened. They managed to clip their runners on the wall on the way out of the base and then stacked the helicopter 100 feet outside of the wall of the FOB. Both the guys were okay. You obviously get out and legged it back into the FOB and they were fine. But we've just stacked a multi-million-pound helicopter. It's hard to imagine. Back then, that would have been front page news. Although, we lose a helicopter. You don't often lose helicopters. They're very expensive. They're very protected. And it would have been a massive PR win for the Taliban. So not only would it have been really embarrassing for us, real battlefield consequences of an emboldened Taliban, of them using that to engage more fighters, to convince the locals that they're more powerful, all those consequences.
Yeah, and what they would do, to take it back to misinformation, is take a video of it crashing and make out like they'd done it themselves. Exactly,
100%. And they would have done that in every region, right? Because they would have really, that's what they were experts at. Really bad. And Roskemp just happened to be frickin' there, like with his producer.
Just to complicate it
Just
a
to
little
go,
bit more.
oh, look at that Apache stacking into the ground. So I get a call from the FOB going, we've got a bit of a problem. We've crashed a helicopter. I was like, oh, that's bad. Yeah, that's really bad. He's like, that's not the problem. The problem is Roskemp's here. I was like, oh, shit. So I was like, thinking quick. Okay, let's talk to Roskemp, because he's there to film a documentary. Right, he might have been married to the lady from
Rebecca Brooks.
Rebecca Brooks,
right.
yeah.
So there's a real link there to real tabloid front page news. But let's talk to him first and see if we can make a deal here. So we spoke, and actually Roskemp is such a legend. He's like, I'm here to film a documentary. I'm not here for news. All right, that's not my job. And if I do that, I lose credibility, I lose relationship, I lose trust. And he's a really good guy with the troops. He's always there.
That's great to hear that.
And so I had that conversation, and I was like, I trust. I think he's going to stick on. I think he's going to stick on this line. I call the press office and go, look, got a bit of a problem. Roskemp's there. Their immediate response is, we need to release this. We need to get ahead of this. And I was like, on balance, I think we'll be okay. I believe Roskemp. And it was a massive call at the time. But it worked because he didn't leak it. He absolutely kept to his word. For all I know, this is the first time it's been discussed.
Wow. An exclusive. Another exclusive.
There was a claim by the Taliban about 3 months later about them downing a helicopter, but they did it in a different region of Afghanistan. And so we were like, no, that's not true at all.
Well, let's get
It's a
Ross.
different region.
We'll get Ross on the next show, shall we?
Oh, yeah. I'll let you book it.
I think the best thing,
perspective.
and this is a weird thing, like thinking back, was this in my memory? Did I actually say this? I think I said, could you hide the helicopter?
Could you hide the helicopter?
Because we did when I was seeing it, and they're like, well, I think someone's got a parachute, because there's Paris, right? I think someone put a parachute over the top of it, like just to hide it, so people wouldn't get evidence of a crashed helicopter, just what looked
Nothing
like
to see here.
Nothing to see here, move along.
And then I've got another story. I'm
enjoying these fuck-ups.
I know, so am I.
It's a slightly higher scale than we normally get, aren't they?
Yeah. What about the story that you had a little bit of a editing issue with The Sun?
Oh man. That's a really painful example, right? Because we have this constant problem. If you're a press officer, especially for a government department, you have this problem that no journalist trusts anything you say. It's such a combative relationship in many cases. Sometimes you get some working relationships and an element of trust, but often it's quite combative. And none more so was the case with Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun, who was the defense editor, I think, at the time, or he was just a journalist. At the time I was in the press office. So the way it works in the press office is...
The press office for...
The MOD.
The MOD, yeah.
So the way it works is at the end of each evening, you run through the lines of the stories that you think are going to break that night. And different journalists work on different areas. Different press officers work on different areas, right? So they all work on their own lines. They format it to a single kind of edition of these lines to take, so that when you're doing the overnight shift, because it's a 24/7 press office, you've got all the lines you need to defend against any story that could come up. So that's kind of how it works. And I was on the overnight shift.
It's like a battle plan in itself.
100%, and definitely in the middle of a war. So it's like, it's routine, it's diligent. It's really, I honestly...
Sounds interesting.
I loved my time in the press office. It was really formative for me. But in that period, we had a story about, I can't remember the exact details it was. It was about the number of troops. I'm going to say it was mental illness. It was about the number of troops that leave the armed forces and suffer from some kind of mental illness. And I think there was a whole number in there. And in my lines, that number was something like 2,000. So when I see the early edition of the cuts and I see the Sun story and it's running 20,000, I'm like, they've made a massive mistake. I've got the numbers here. It's 2,000. I've got all the lines from the policy experts. So I call up the desk and it's like, we've got a problem. I think you've made a mistake. I don't want you to run with 20,000. I think it's wrong. They couldn't get hold of Tom to check the numbers with. I couldn't get hold of the specialist from my team, the press officer. So we had this agreement, me and the guy running the news, like, I think we need to change it. So they changed it. And the next morning, that story comes out at 2,000, only to find my colleague had forgotten to update the number from 2,000 to 20,000. The Sun had the right number, and I just nixed Tom's story completely.
And
he
so-
was furious, absolutely furious, and rightly so.
Were you dreading that phone call from him?
Oh,
But
that
it
was not
first
fun.
thing, wasn't
That's
it?
the worst. When you get a bollocking from a journalist.
Yeah, and you
know
deserve it,
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
Oh, that was not
I've
good.
had a few of those in my time, and it's not
we
pleasant,
all-
is it?
Not only, and the realization, not only did I mess up that story, but I've just set back any relationship I had with Tom and any relationship, any trust he might have had in the press office. Because now he believes that we're that kind of press office that we would automatically just try and, screw him over on a number, Well, on my day one on the press office, I was told, we never lie and we never say no comment. And I was like, oh, that's tough. And I held to that, absolutely held to that. But
You never say no comment, the Ministry of Defence?
No.
Wow. That's quite impressive.
Yeah, there's a line when it comes to special forces operations. We don't comment on the details of special forces operations. They're very specific, kind of no comment. But otherwise, we always kind of give some kind of line, because no comment just allows the journalist to create the story for you, right?
I ask everybody who comes on the show, now that you've done some interviews and you've talked about your mistakes and what you've learned and the fascinating misinformation side of things, if you were us, who would you next get on the show to talk about their failures and fuck-ups?
Apart from David Cameron and Ross Kemp.
Lord Cameron, if you're listening, we are available.
That's interesting. But so naming a person would suggest I think that person has fucked up a lot, right?
No, not necessarily.
Is that
just that they've got a good story to tell? That's what I like.
I would honestly, not just because of the AI aspect of Greg Matusky. He's just a great talker. He's a really fun guy. And he's definitely got, I think, a forward-looking vision of what's going to happen to the industry. And I think he's old and bold enough to probably have a fair few of those stories. So I'd probably go with Greg Matusky from Gregory FCA in the US.
Great.
And if our listeners want to find you online, where can they find you?
LinkedIn's my network of choice. At the moment, you can find me there.
And you use the name that your mother uses.
My full mother name, Anthony Cousins without an H.
Yeah, cool.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Massive value and massive entertainment, I think, for our listeners. And that was just a brilliant podcast, which I think we both really enjoyed.
I felt like we could have gone for another hour, to be honest. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming up and seeing us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Will, Ant was a fascinating bloke. What a guy. I mean, his work history was fascinating. His fuck-ups were brilliant. He had another one that I didn't have time to ask him. And after he left the studio, as we were walking out, I said, we're going to have to get him back on because he's got a whole load of other stories to tell.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it was a really interesting take on AI that's a little bit different to the ground we've covered before. I think a lot of the conversation in the industry at the moment is about things like the ethical implications of AI, quite tactical applications when it comes to PR. But that was really insightful and actionable and quite concerning for brands, really, this idea of misinformation. And I think it could impact any kind of brand. You don't have to be a Coca-Cola or a Disney. You could be an SME, you could be a smaller FMCG type brand, but yeah, really, really interesting.
I mean, so I suppose the interesting thing is we've been doing crisis management all our careers, and we've been using social media listening since it came out, 2006, 2007, something like that, and we use it to identify the key protagonists as we discussed on the interview. But now that AI can do it so much quicker and get right back to the source of where things are coming out, that is just going to save people's brand guardians and marketers out there. It's just going to save them so much more time to stop the disinformation, because you have to make a decision. Like you mentioned it during the interview, Will, where you pick the top 10 to engage with out of 100 conversations if you're a big brand. So that's it. Just tells me that everything's speeding up, if anything.
Yeah, and for me, the big takeaway I got from this was, just as you would be with crisis management, when it comes to misinformation, brands need to be prepared. So it's kind of preempting those misinformation situations that might impact you, and it's publishing content in line with them preemptively, so that when and if misinformation does happen, you're prepared and you've got a good story to tell. Otherwise, you're just on the back foot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Unacceptable. If you haven't done it already, please click subscribe and drop us a comment if you want to let us know what you think of the show. And if you've got a question for any of our guests, feel free to drop it through. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you for listening to Socially Unacceptable. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review. Don't forget to follow us on social media on Instagram, TikTok and LinkedIn at Prohibition PR, and Twitter at Socially UA. We would love to hear some of your career fuck-ups so we can share them on the show. For more information on the show, search Prohibition PR in your search engine and click on podcasts. Until next time, please keep pushing the boundaries and embracing the socially unacceptable.